This edition of Mac Voices is supported by you, our viewers and listeners, through our new Patreon campaign. If you get value from Mac Voices, please consider helping support the show by visiting patreon.com/MacVoices. And by the MacVoices Dispatch, our weekly newsletter to keep you up on all the latest from Mac Voices. Watch or listen to Mac Voices straight from your email client. Sign up at MacVoices.com/newsletter and stay up to date. Welcome to Mac Voices. This is a talk of the Apple community, and I'm Chuck Joyner. Folks, a little while ago, we kind of caught up with Adam Engst after way too long an absence, and this time we get to talk to Tonya Engst after not quite as long an absence. I think, Tonya, you and I have talked a little more often than Adam and I, but anyway, it's good to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you, and thanks for having me on the show.
It's always a pleasure. This time, though, we're not going to just sort of riff on the topics, the broad topics we usually do. This time, you're back as a Take Control author, not editor-in-chief, but an author.
That's right.
This is great, of Take Control of Mac Basics.
Yes.
And I want to talk about a little bit about the history of this book, because this is, it's not your first. Well, is it? I guess it's technically your first Take Control book, but it does stem from an earlier project.
Well, just to be clear, I actually had a book for quite a few years called Take Control of, I think it was Your iPad, or maybe it became Your iPad Basics or something like that. But that book has not been updated in 5 or 6 years. But that was really my first experience as a Take Control author. But my second experience indeed was with a book called Read Me First, a Take Control crash course. And this new book that I'm creating just as an author now is based on that crash course manuscript.
And of course, the crash course format was quite a bit more abbreviated, quite a bit more, quick topic kind of thing. The Take Control books usually follow a bit of a different format. They go a little more in depth, although they don't, not to the point that they bore you. In some ways, Tonya, I would think this is a challenging subject, because to try to put aside all the accumulated knowledge you have about the Mac OS and approach it with very, very fresh eyes. Obviously you have to have that depth of knowledge to create a basics book, but at the same time, I think it's so easy to overlook things and maybe have a hard time prioritizing what you want to cover.
Sure. Prioritizing was very challenging, because you could write a book that just covers the basics of using the Mac that goes on for thousands and thousands of pages, because the topic is so very big. And there have been so very many great books written about one slice of that broad topic, such as what to do if you have some kind of a disability, so you have to adjust your Mac so you can deal with vision or hearing problems. What to do if you're mostly a musician and you're really interested in audio software. What to do if you're mostly a desktop publisher and you're mostly interested in layout software. So there's a whole lot of kind of niche situations which encompass millions and millions of people, and that the Mac is a primary machine for those people in lots of important ways. And for the most part, because I was supposed to come in at 100 pages. I failed. I came in at 140 pages, which is okay, but I really couldn't do, the 1,000-page compendium, or maybe you, Chuck, or people listening remember the Mac Bibles of yore. The Mac Bible was a book put out by PeachPit, which did try to really encompass as much as it could anyway. And I would say, I don't think I'm going out on a limb to say that those were about 1,000 pages long. They were just enormous. I mean, they were like, this thick. They were huge. So I tried not to do that. I tried to write this book for people who are either new to the Mac because they've been using Windows for a long time. They're new to the Mac because they're young, although I think most young people don't read books these days. So there's that. Or for people who have been using the Mac for quite a while, but have not expanded their skill set beyond a very small set of things they need to know what to do just to accomplish a few things. And they're wanting to take it up a next level, or they've got a lot of questions about features that Apple has introduced in the last 5 or 10 years. as there is some really cool new stuff where if you learn the Mac, if you became very competent on the Mac, say in the 1990s, there's a lot of new stuff since then. So, but the two people who I did not really write this book for are as follows. There is a kind of person who perhaps has just never used a computer before. And this book is probably not basic enough. So, for example, I don't devote any particular amount of time to explaining how to click or how to double click, or the whole move your hand kind of metaphor. And it's just because with what was supposed to be only 100 pages, I just felt that the vast majority of the people know how to do this, or if they don't, they'll find out in some other way. But I have always felt that a book is not an especially good way to teach those skills anyway, because it's like learning to knit from reading a book. You're just so much better off with someone showing you in person. So there are just a few of those super basic things which I have omitted, because I do feel that anyone in a position to buy a Take Control book in the first place needs to know how to click, or they've got a friend or family member who is giving them this book and they can get help there. The other type of person who this book is not going to be perfect for is the type of person people often tell me I should write this book, and I never will. It is the book for the older person who gets very confused and frustrated by computers, sort of the senior citizen's guide to the Mac. And I don't think that a book actually can be written for those people. I live within a 10-mile drive of both of my parents who are in their 70s and both of my in-laws who are in their 70s. And I do occasionally or even frequently help them with computer problems. And I think, and some of them are fairly competent computer users actually, and they have more sophisticated questions. But what I've seen is when sometimes they come up with that kind of question that only an old person could ask, it's such a special and unique question to them and their point of view on the world, that I don't think 100-page or even necessarily 1,000-page book would be able to be useful to each of these people with their special, unique points of view on the world. That they really need to talk to a person to get help, because that person may know them personally, or that person can ask them a few follow-on questions to kind of figure out what they're trying to do. So this book is not going to be that sort of ultimate guide for your 85-year-old mother who's struggling to use her Mac, unless she's enough of kind of a mainstream user that she can kind of fit. If the roundness of herself can fit the roundness of the whole of the book, then all is well. But if she's actually more of a square shape or, a butterfly shape, it just might not work.
We've had folks that specialize in senior technology consulting on, and it does. I think you're very wise. It's a whole different discipline, because the people from those generations come at it with not a lot of frames of reference to things like menus and pull downs and even mouse control, and so it's a whole different world.
And let's be clear, there are folks in that generation who, when the Mac came out or when personal computers came out, they were absolutely all over it at that time. Maybe they were already in their 30s, 40s, 50s, but they completely coped with it then. And certainly plenty of senior citizens now are, quite wise and quite competent on their computers. But I think we all know sort of the type that I'm sort of trying to describe. Yeah. So I think there's a difference between basics for someone who just hasn't yet taken the time to explore, and basics for someone who is just often confused.
Yeah, that comment was by no means intended as disparaging to any age groups. Yeah. But you're right. There is a type of person, and sometimes they don't even have to be that quote unquote old or in a certain age group. It's just that they don't have the experience, and nothing wrong with that. It just requires a different kind of book. One other thing that struck me as a challenge for this book, Tonya, is how far do you go with the book? And what I mean by that is Apple has done a great job of adding in so many applications that are borderline parts of the OS. I'm thinking preview is a prime example. It's an application, but it also is used so much. TextEdit is another good one. Do you try to cover those in any depth in the book, or do you just sort of pass over them, or try to do it within the frame of a basics book?
Well, it really wouldn't be possible to cover all of them in one book. As far as any kind of depth. I mean, just to give you an idea, there actually is a Take Control of Preview book, and it's like 110 pages on its own. So clearly, not possible. But what this book actually does do is it goes through the default applications folder on a Mac. So the folder that contains the built-in applications that you get for free when you buy a new Mac, and it goes through each application that's in there and just provides somewhere between maybe as little as a sentence and maybe as much as, say, 3 paragraphs. Mostly about a paragraph, and it just gives you an overview of like, what is this thing for? What can you do with it? And for the most part, it usually provides some tip, some kind of a tip that's just, kind of my favorite basic tip for getting more out of this application, or some kind of a pointer if you need to configure something in the application's preferences before you can really get started with it. For example, with FaceTime, which is Apple's video chat app, kind of like Skype, only you need Apple products on both ends. You're really not going to get anywhere with it until you go into the preferences for that application and set things up. And it's a little weird. So I get into that a little bit in the book, just so people can get started. There's also a folder in the applications folder on every Mac called Utilities. And inside of Utilities, there are, I don't know, maybe 15 sort of mini apps called Utilities that have very specialized functions on the Mac. And I go through each of those also and give them kind of the same treatment, although shorter, but just so people know, what is this thing for? And I even learned some stuff. There are things in the Utilities folder that I just had never paid attention to ever in my whole life. So, for instance, there is a utility. I didn't test it personally, and I'm not so sure that it would actually work. But what it is supposed to do is, if you have some old cell phone, not an Apple phone, not an iPhone, but just some old cell phone that uses Bluetooth. Bluetooth is just a wireless technology for transferring information between 2 devices. So if it's a Bluetooth phone and it has a address book on it, with your friends' names and their phone numbers. Apparently, this utility can move that contact information off this old phone using Bluetooth onto your Mac.
I didn't know that.
I didn't even know this thing was there. I'm worried that it may not actually work very well because Bluetooth can be a little dodgy, but it's there, and my book at least tells you what you can do with it. And then there's also some stuff in the utilities folder that is used much more commonly, like disk utility, which you would use perhaps in the context of repairing a bad disk or starting a new disk. So I get into all that. And that took up some of the book, some of my allocation of 100 pages. But it was kind of nice because later on in the book, sometimes I need to mention that you might use a particular app for some particular step in a task. And I can link from later in the book to earlier in the book so that people can get that working. Perhaps the most interesting part of the book in that regard was when I created my outline. I was working with Joe Kissel. Joe's the publisher of Take Control now, and he was an author for many years. So it was interesting because Joe and I had kind of flipped roles. Normally, I was kind of the editor-in-chief publisher person advising people on their outlines, and they were kind of struggling to make a good outline. So we flipped. And I put in this kind of offhand comment, like, hey, maybe I should cover all the system preference panes. And Joe wrote, yeah, that'd be good. So I got into that chapter and I'm like, there are a lot of preference panes. Let's count. Well, with my particular laptop, with its particular hardware configuration, there seem to be 33 system preference panes. So let's do the math. So the book is supposed to be 100 pages long. Clearly, I cannot devote a full page to each preference pane. So that was kind of interesting, but it was really cool to go through all the panes. Now, this book is not, I do not exhaustively explain every single checkbox and every single button and every single pane, because I could not, because the book, but what I did do was I focused on the things that I thought would be the most valuable to know about for someone who was looking for kind of Mac basics help. And I found that very interesting because, for one thing, I had to learn a few things that I maybe wasn't quite expert on, so I could give the best advice. But also interesting because, again, later in the book, when I needed to give people instructions for completing certain tasks, I could keep referring back to those system preferences over and over and over. So I have a topic that talks about how to shut down your Mac, which is pretty basic thing, but it turns out like you might not want to just shut down your Mac. That might not be really very efficient or effective for you. It might be that it would be a lot better to turn on your screensaver, or it would be a lot better to just walk away from the Mac and let it sleep itself when it's time for it to do that. And all those settings for sleeping and screensavering and all of that are in the system preferences. So I was able to write a pretty elegant, short explanation later in the book, and then just link back to the system preferences information for people who wanted to get in there and configure their Mac. So it turned out to be a pretty cool topic, and it was a very interesting challenge to say, okay, we're going to cover each preference pane in a half a page or less, not counting screenshots, because I did put in some screenshots. But it was challenging to really look at those panes and say, okay, from the standpoint of someone who is at a more kind of basic level, what is the most important? And also, what's the most important but not obvious? So if you get into a preference pane and it says something like, it doesn't quite say it like this, but just for the sake of discussion, if it says, do you want the dock to be horizontal or vertical? You can click the checkbox for horizontal or vertical and look at your dock and see what it does. It's not very surprising. One way it's horizontal, it is across the bottom of your screen, which might be or might not be surprising. Or if it's vertical, you can put it on the left or the right. There's even buttons in there for left or right. So it's interesting to know that it's there, but it's pretty obvious once you look at it what it's going to do. But then there's some checkboxes and radio buttons where you can look at them all you want, but that doesn't mean you're going to figure out what they do. So, like there's an option for application windows. Like what's application windows, right? Like who knows, right? So I try to pull out the stuff that I think would be genuinely useful, interesting, or fun for someone at a Mac Basics level, but that in particular, they may not really be able to figure out what's going on without some help.
I mean, you kind of hit it because the way I was referring to some of the apps earlier, I think you said mini apps. I mean, there's so many things. I know some of the utilities that I use that are in the utilities folder. I haven't opened the utilities folder in I don't know how long. So there apparently are things hiding in there that I need to go and look at. But the preference panes, that also is so important because it controls so much of the operation or the abilities of the Mac. So you almost have to get down and tell people kind of what's where, so then you can refer them to that and let them know, okay, this is how you control the size of the icons, or the way that the Finder displays things. So that's it. A basics book is a big challenge.
It was a lot of fun. And then I was also able to cover a few things that are just like my personal pet peeves that I worry that people don't know what to do. So, for instance, there seems to be this belief among Apple and other computer companies that people are too busy, too something, to cope with the idea that they can make folders on their Mac and then file their stuff into their folders. And I totally get that some people really are too busy, too confused, or just too, and they're just going to put their stuff somewhere on their Mac and hope that it's still there and they can find it when they come back to it. And I certainly work that way some of the time, especially when I'm just like really busy with a lot of stuff. But the idea that people would be unable to learn how to file their stuff, I find just wrong. So my book definitely covers what is going on the Mac with all those folders and kind of how they're related to each other. So just like with an old-fashioned filing cabinet or a refrigerator, say, when you open it up, there are going to be folders, or when you open a refrigerator, there's probably a few shelves. My cat's coming to help.
We have more cats and dogs makes appearances on MacVoices. It's kind of amazing.
Yes, so you get into, say the refrigerator, and there's the vegetable crisper drawer. Now, you don't have to put your vegetables in the vegetable crisper drawer, and certainly plenty of people don't, but you're aware that there's a drawer there, and you probably are aware that the people who made the refrigerator thought you would put vegetables in it. And just like on the Mac, you've got your own home folder, which I explain in great detail what the deal with the home folder is, and where it is, and why it is. And in the home folder, there is, say, a documents folder where the assumption is that you may put your files into that folder. You don't have to. It's okay if you don't. But I just want everybody to kind of know what those assumptions are that are being made and how they can play within that field, as far as you don't really have to put your stuff in there. And in fact, sometimes Apple's applications don't put your stuff in there for you, like if you've got iCloud Drive set up or something. So I talk a lot about that. I talk about where the desktop folder is, how that relates to the actual desktop, which is the colored backdrop that's kind of behind everything on your Mac screen, and how to make things easier to see when you're working in those areas. Making the font smaller or bigger, or changing the way things appear. So there's a lot about that, because I would just hate to think that someone was using their Mac and just wasn't aware of how it all fits together.
So many ways to customize how you use your Mac to tweak it to suit you. But if you're coming at it from ground zero, yeah, it would be nice to say, okay, here's a right way and here's a wrong way to do things. And on the Mac, I mean, yes, occasionally there are really, honest to God, wrong ways, but not that often. Usually it's just, okay, do I prefer the dock on the right, the left, or in the bottom? That kind of thing. There's no right. Well,
all good.
Yeah, there's some people that would disagree with that. There's some people that say, this. I mean, it's their cause to make sure that you put the dock one place or the other. But at the end of the day, it really is up to you. And so, trying to strike that balance between, okay, here are some options, and here's the right way. Because you hate to be negative and say, here's the wrong way to do something, other than something that would lose you your data. No, don't store things in the trash can, because that's not a good idea. But beyond that, yeah, it's interesting.
I mean, the book is fairly judgmental in that I made a lot of judgment calls about what to put in the book. But I think once you're reading the book, you're not going to feel like you're being steered in a strong way. It's sort of, do what you will with it. It's all good, basically. It's not especially proscriptive, but it is definitely telling you about your options and why you would pick something. Why a certain thing would be a good idea for you or not, but it's up to you.
Tonya, after all this time trying to look at the Mac from this perspective, is there anything in particular that you found like extra confusing, or that you really had to pay attention to, or that you really wanted to call out and say, hey, you need to understand this because it is confusing?
Well, so, I learned the Mac back in the 1980s. And I actually did tech support at a university-based bookstore or computer store for a few years. Right after college, I worked at Cornell University, and I helped people who had all different kinds of computer problems with their problems. And then I actually worked at Microsoft and did tech support there for a few years for Microsoft Word. So as far as the early days of the Mac go, I've seen it all. I've troubleshooted it all. There's really very little that phases me about old style Mac stuff. More recently, though, some of the stuff that Apple's put out in the last, I'm not even sure how long, but let's say the last decade. So, for example, mission control, which is this whole sort of new way of interacting with your Mac, where you kind of tunnel into this hidden view, and then you can switch into it, make a different window current from what was current, or you can arrange your windows in all kinds of exciting ways. I would learn how to use this every year when Take Control would create its next book about Apple's big operating system. And I would think about, you can press F3 and you get into mission control, with this view, and you press, control up arrow, 9 or whatever it is, you get in with this other view, or you can swipe on the trackpad in these different ways to get in. And I'd learn it for about a week and it'd seem really cool. And then I would just go back to my old ways and not learn it. And Apple kept changing things around, it seemed like, too. So it didn't seem like it always worked the same way when I learned it. So it was harder to learn it. But I have started actually using it sometimes, and I feel as though the various checkboxes and the system preferences have kind of settled in. And it was nice to write about it and take some time with it as an author. The book definitely, has some information about that, because I think it's a little hidden, because you still have to get into it in some way. You still have to press a key on your keyboard or swipe with your finger, but it seems like Apple has really baked it into the operating system. It's got its fingers in a lot of places, and it is worth learning. So it appears several times in the book in different ways, and I think that's a good thing.
Do you try to get people into mission control and spaces and those kind of things, or is that really, you think, beyond the level of Mac Basics?
I don't think it can be beyond the level of Mac Basics, because there's a whole system preference pane for it. But because I think that people learn and do in different ways. And so for some people, the desktop really is, Apple's original operating system or original user interface and way that you would interact with your files and folders on your Mac. And it's old. It's based on the metaphor of a desk with files and folders on it. And increasingly, people don't work that way anymore. So I think mission control is Apple's way of just giving people other ways to think about their windowed environment, instead of thinking primarily what file or folder do I want to work on next. It lets people think more about what window do I want to be in next, what application do I want to be in next, what 2 applications do I want to use together next. And so I think it is a somewhat more modern way of looking at it, and it is also just, sort of like different learning styles, different working styles. My book does not detail every last thing there is to know about mission control, and there is actually more information in my colleague Shelley Sawyer's book. She does the, Take Control of Sierra, Take Control of High Sierra, those books. So her book actually kind of glosses over some of the basics a little bit, but then it goes farther. It goes farther with more of the nuances and more of the different little special ways that you can work with mission control. But I think for my book, for someone who is curious, there's enough there to absolutely bite into and get started. And I think that's part of it when I was saying I'm not trying to cover your really fundamentally new user, someone who has never used the Mac before and is new to computing. I don't think there are very many people who are new to computing unless they're about 7 years old. So I'm trying to kind of say, okay, there's this thing called mission control. Here's what you should know about it. You need to know at least this much to know whether you want to use it or not. Maybe you don't want to use it, totally fine. But if you do want to use it, here's a few intriguing things to know about it that might entice you to be curious about it or to want to try it. And then, here's, a couple of things you can do with it. So just kind of putting it out there for people so they can they can use it. And I think for a lot of people who maybe did learn to use the Mac in the 1980s or the 1990s, some of these new features are not yet comfortable. They're not yet fluid with them. And this is a chance to find out about them in sort of, the privacy of your own ebook. You don't have to track down some teenager to show you how to use them or something. You can, one thing that really struck me when I was working on this book, and it's a trend that's been going on for a long time, but typically I would kind of write what I thought I wanted to say about a topic, and then I would get on the internet and see what other people had said about it. Maybe I had missed something important, right? So I felt that, maybe it's me, but I don't think so. I think a lot of information on the internet that you can Google for has gotten increasingly trashy, for lack of a better term. There's just an awful lot of content that has, videos interspersed amongst it. So you really can't read more than a paragraph or two without some completely unrelated video just playing at you. Or maybe it's a decent article, but you get to the bottom of it and there's these sort of lurid, link bait kind of clickable things that you can click to find out about, the mysteries of co-joined twins or, whatever it is. And it's really hard to, get your question. You can get your question answered, maybe more or less, but it's just not the same environment that it was even a couple of years ago. So one thing I think that people may enjoy about the book, or the book may more value, more utility to people than I would have 5 years ago, because you can read in it. There's really no ads inside of it, and there's no videos, and it's just a book with a lot of internal links, so you can move around it within the book, and that's kind of it. So you can learn a lot of stuff without being distracted.
Yeah. Your point about the things on the internet, I mean, you're absolutely right. I know that every website owner is trying to pay the bills and make money, but they're slowly but surely destroying the sources of information.
I think it's gone too far, because that's something that we often have done in the Take Control series, and I do in my book, is if we feel that we have covered a topic adequately for what we can do in the book, but that there really is a lot more great stuff to know, we'll link out to an article on the internet that we think fills that void. But I would find articles that actually did answer questions, but I was like, I can't recommend this to my reader. This is a horrible article. There's movies of, trucks blowing up all over it. So what is with this? So I just couldn't do it. And Apple actually has pretty good information on their website. And the more you search on their site, the better you get at pulling it up on the first try. But, it is, it is a corporate website, and it just doesn't have the kind of color and context that you're going to find in a book.
Right.
So
it's not designed to be. It's designed to be reference. It's not designed to be educational. Yeah, I mean, I think it is. I think their tone and the way they approach it is correct for a company's knowledge base, but that does leave room for third-party books. So yeah. Okay, so to wrap this up, give me two things that maybe were. Not that you didn't know necessarily, but maybe that were the most difficult or the most surprising to you that you felt like you needed to include to educate people that maybe you didn't anticipate being challenging or that might even needed to be included.
All right. Well, I'll tell you one thing that was something for me and one thing that was for my editor. So for me, the one thing I wanted to include was this thing called versioning. So what is versioning? So versioning is a feature Apple added, 7 years ago, let's just say, somewhere around then. And not all applications support it, but those that do, basically, they keep saving your file for you kind of in the background as you work. So it's not like related to you saving, it's just the application saves. And then if you want to go back to a previous version of your file, and I'll explain why you might want to, you just go up to the file menu and kind of choose a command, and you get sort of warped into this alternative interface where you can compare the current state of your document to the state of your document at other times in the past. And you can scroll back to see, what was the document like yesterday? What was it like last week? What was it like on Sunday? And then once you decide which document you want to look at, you can actually scroll through it and read it. You can copy out of it. You can even restore that version of the document to the present. So this is very helpful. Let's say you're writing a 140-page book, and you get up in the morning and you look at it and you're like, it was 140 pages yesterday. I think it was, but right now it's only 90 pages. What happened, right? Like, what happened? So you would obviously want to go to some form of a backup to find your missing 50 pages. And hopefully you do have backups, so you have a lot of options. But this versioning thing is very quick. It just takes, like 10 seconds to call it up. And then you can go in and you can figure out how long ago was it that you lost your 50 pages. Maybe it was overnight, but maybe it was 3 days ago and you just didn't notice, right? So you can find it. Maybe it's just one graphic or one paragraph that somehow got deleted a month ago, right? But you want it back. So that versioning feature lets you get it back. And I had just never really taken the time to explore. It's not at all a hard feature. You just have to know that it's there and be confident of the directions.
And the thing for the editor, that was yours.
Yep. So my editor, system preferences is where you configure all the different aspects of how your Macintosh works generally. So it's not, you don't really use system preferences to configure how a particular application works. Like you wouldn't use system preferences for how Pages works or how Excel works or something like that. But you would use it for how your screensaver works, how your dock works, what your highlight color is, all kinds of things. And as I said before, there are probably going to be about 33 preference panes on your Mac. There's a lot of them. And Apple arranges them. They all appear. They each get an icon in this one window. And you click on one of these icons to get into that particular set of preferences. So Apple arranges them in this particular window in 5 or 6 categories. And the categories are supposed to be for, I don't know, like software stuff, hardware stuff, networking stuff. Apple doesn't actually say what the names of the categories are, but that's what I think they might be thinking. So the problem with this is nobody can ever remember what goes in what category. So like, where does privacy and security go? Or, where does energy saver go? It's always like, where the heck is this stuff? So, what I did was there's an option on the view menu in system preferences to view your preference panes alphabetically. So then those categories go away. They're just listed alphabetically from A to Z. So accessibility, which starts with an A, is the very first one. And I forget what the last one is, but it might be users and accounts, which happens to start, users and groups, which happens to start with a U. So, I just said, basically, my chapter is arranged alphabetically for, convenience of the reader, and here's how you get to alphabetical. And Shali said, I never knew you could do that. I never knew you could view your system preference panes alphabetically. And I think that's actually what a lot of people will encounter when they get to this book is there are so very many Mac basics. There are that I think even pretty sophisticated users will find a few tips that they just didn't know. Did you know that in High Sierra, you can log into a wireless network even if you don't know the password?
No, I didn't know you could do that.
Well, it's a little tricky. You have to have access to another Apple computer or mobile device that is logged into the network. And there's some fine print on that. But basically, if you go to someone's house with your laptop and you need to get on the wireless network there, if you're at a friend's house, if your friend's iPhone is logged into the wireless network, you just put the iPhone and the laptop near each other. You're in.
Okay.
Yeah. So I've got some
I do sometimes. I get concerned that that any basic book, anything that says basic, is going to turn people off a little bit. Well, I'm a power user, and I don't care what kind of power you are. I didn't know about the control panel, or pardon me, the preference pane alphabetization. I mean, that's fascinating.
Right.
So
this book.
There's so much built into this operating system, and we don't take advantage of nearly enough of it. And that's not going to. I doubt that that's going to make or break anybody's use of the computer, but it certainly could potentially make things easier just to find sometimes when you're going down that list.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, I mean, the thing is, you got to remember, it's been my job for the last almost 15 years to sit all day, every day at my computer screen and edit books about using the Mac. And I just have picked up a lot of information.
Sure.
So, but I do feel that everything in my book is masterable, is understandable by just like your typical everyday Macintosh user. And truly and honestly, there is so much more stuff that is just a little bit more advanced, but you definitely get 140 pages of what I would say is the most essential basic stuff.
I have an idea. I'm going to want to run through it because they've already told me a couple things I didn't know about. So I don't know what else might be in there lurking that I'm not aware of.
Well, the one thing that's in there definitely is that whole feature with logging onto a wireless network. Even if you don't know the password, there is some fine print on how to get that to work. It's fascinating, and it's a good thing that I have links in my book to the description of the contacts application, because there is something you have to do there too. So, fascinating stuff.
Great. So how much is the book? And well, you've already described who it's for, so we know that. But how much is the book? And of course, you can get it at takecontrolbooks.com.
Mm-hmm. The book is $15. If you are a Tidbits member, you should be sure to take advantage of your 30% off discount on all Take Control books. Yep, $15.
Great. Well, certainly, I think you've already given us $15 worth of knowledge here, just with a couple of these tips. So that means there's that much more to get out of the book. So I'm looking forward to spending a little time with it.
Cool.
Tonya, we have to get you back more often. In fact, I've got a couple ideas of things I want to talk to you about, but we'll save that for another time. But for right now, thanks for being here, and happy holidays.
Thank you. Happy Thanksgiving and happy.
Folks, I'm Chuck Joyner. I'm Chuck Joyner. This is Mac Voices. We'll be back with more soon. Until then, happy to you too. Visit MacVoices.com for show notes and to connect with Chuck on social media. Get involved in our Mac Voices Facebook group and get more out of your Apple tech with MacVoices Magazine, free on Flipboard. And if you find value in it all, consider supporting us at patreon.com/MacVoices. Advertising handled by Backbeat Media at backbeatmedia.com. Bandwidth provided by CashFly at cashfly.com.